Our first speaker is Dr. Daniel Reynaud, who is an Associate Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Theology at Avondale College of Higher Education in Australia. And we're very glad, I may say, that we have two people who've made the very long journey from Australia to be with us. So a special welcome, Dan. His PhD from Newcastle University was on the Australian cinema of the Great War, a subject which two other monographs on other subjects. His current research is on the Australian Anzacs and religion, and he is currently completing a biography of a prominent Australian military chaplain. Our second speaker is Dr. Edward Allen, who served as a pastor for 30 years in Northern California, Hong Kong, and Southern California. He has both a DMin and a PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary. His PhD dissertation was on Nicholas Bound and the context of Sabbatarianism in early modern England. He has been at Union College for 8.5 years and is currently Professor of Religion and Director of the Union Scholars Honours Programme, and he is also, of course, the current President of the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians. And our third speaker, Nicholas Miller, is Associate Professor of Church History at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University in Michigan. And Nick, we're glad that presumably you flew a little early, you drove, so we're glad to have you with us. At Andrews, he also directs the International Religious Liberty Institute. He is a graduate of the Columbia University Law School and has a PhD in American Religious and Legal History from the University of what I would like to say is Notre Dame, but I suspect that's not how it's pronounced in South Bend. Dr. Miller has appeared before the US Supreme Court and is the author of 12 scholarly journal articles and book chapters dealing with the history of church, state, and society. And his book on the development of religious freedom in America, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, was recently published by Oxford University Press. So those are our three speakers. We'll proceed now, and then, as I said, we'll take questions and discussion at the end.
Good morning. I'm speaking today on an overview perspective of Adventism and Adventist history. And I'm preaching to the choir when I say that history's always been core to Adventism. Its founders were driven by historical imperatives, beginning with William Miller, who interpreted Scripture in the light of history. It's no accident that his principal work was entitled Evidences from Scripture and History of the Second Coming of Christ about the year AD 1843 and of his personal reign for 1,000 years. The problem with reading the titles of these writers is it takes up all of my 15 minutes. There are three core things in Miller's approach: evidence, Scripture, and history. And early Sabbatarian Adventism cherished all three of those components. I want to look briefly at three key writers of early Adventism who used history. The first is Uriah Smith. Like many early Adventists, he was self-educated. And of these three chief works that are historically oriented, the most important and influential was Thoughts Critical and Practical on the Book of Revelation, Thoughts Critical and Practical on the Book of Daniel, which were then combined into a single volume. He used history to validate his interpretations of biblical apocalyptic, and he listed his sources at the end to indicate his reliance on the classic Protestant works of history at the time. His second major work was The United States in Prophecy, which was also extensively revised, tracing the history of the USA from the perspective that divine providence was guiding its development. Now, Smith didn't discount conventional historians, but he felt that they didn't go far enough. He argued that if we believe there is a God who rules in the kingdoms of men, we must look for his providential hand in human history, in the rise, career, and fall of the nations and peoples of the world. And then a third work, which, strictly speaking, wasn't history, was Our Country's Future, in which he predicted what would happen, expecting that history would verify his applications of prophetic work. Smith, in a sense, didn't see himself as revising history. He didn't question the historians that he used. They simply provided him with the evidence that he needed to reveal the workings of God in the affairs of humanity. In fact, he considered history and prophecy to be on the same continuum. History was what happened, prophecy was what would happen. In his words, one was history anticipated, the other prophecy fulfilled. The second and most important writer is, of course, Ellen White. Again, self-educated, read extensively, although her choice of reading was not perhaps as broad as one might wish in the fields of history. She read the classic Protestant historians, as well as in a number of other areas. The readers, the historians that she read were largely those who reflected her own outlook and worldview, and in turn, she used their works heavily in her writings. Her use of history differs from those of other Adventist writers, that she had what would we use, an import, a weight that the others could not claim, that of direct revelation through supernatural visions. During her lifetime, the authority of her historically related works were questioned, and both her and her son William, who acted as her spokesperson, commented on this. Ellen White specifically claimed direct revelation of historical events, which she characteristically described as scenes or views, and which her son described as flashlight pictures. On one occasion, William stated that he was reading to her from Wiley's History of Protestantism, and she stopped him and was able to accurately tell him what was yet to come. William emphatically declared that she was not dependent on historians as other writers were. Yet at the same time, Ellen White denied that her writings were a standard of historical accuracy. She was quite open about the fact that she quoted from established Protestant historians whom she considered to be normative in their facts and interpretation. And indeed, as new editions of these histories became available, she revised some of the historical data in her texts. Her grandson, Arthur L. White, described her work as the subordination of historical detail to the purpose of the book. Despite impressing William with her ability to recite history that she had not yet heard him read, she had, of course, already read extensively in Protestant history over many years. And to say that her visions were the principal source of her historical information is probably an exaggeration. Her frequent unacknowledged borrowings from historians would cause some distress to her followers, both during her lifetime and afterwards. But she was unapologetic in explaining her motives, saying that she gave no specific credit to historians when she borrowed, and I quote, "Since the quotations are not given for the purpose of citing that writer as authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forcible presentation of the subject." In other words, she does not quote as a historian would to back up her claim. It is merely a more convenient, concise and well-expressed way of saying what she needs to say. More recent researchers have debated the extent to which she copied, paraphrased, or even maybe carelessly distorted the historians that she quoted, and debate has raged on whether she borrowed directly from historians or whether she borrowed from Uriah Smith, who borrowed from historians. The fact being, she did not see herself as a historian. She actually wasn't a great fan of the historical profession, which she saw as preoccupied with the achievements of men in wars and the pursuit of human power and greatness. It was sacred history that White considered as being of supreme value, as it revealed the fulfilment of prophecy, the workings of providence in the great reform movements, and the events associated with the end of time. Our third early historian is Alonzo Jones, another passionate amateur historian. He wrote a number of historical works, some of them many hundreds of pages in length, treating topics as diverse as the empires of pagan and Christian Rome, the history of nations from biblical times to the present, the Reformation, biblical chronology, and the rise of the great nations of his day, a fairly broad sphere of historical endeavour. Jones's history was like that of Smith and White, always taking a divine perspective on human affairs. He wrote, "History, properly studied, is but the study of the grand purposes of God with men and nations. It is evident, therefore, that the proper study of history can be made only upon the basis of the Word of God, the Bible. Upon that basis, this history is composed." Jones made no pretense of writing history, but merely of compiling it and applying it. Yet Jones differed particularly from Ellen White by claiming no originality and by quoting all of his sources as the authority for his historical statements. There were other early Adventists who wrote historically as well, including John Andrews, John Loughborough, and James White. But effectively, none of the early Adventist historical writers considered themselves as in any way rewriting the basic historical data. They merely accepted it as true, and the material was there to provide evidence for their arguments. Essentially, they saw all history as apologetic rather than critical. History was a received text, which they used to back up their point. To them, it traced the establishment of the pure apostolic church after the resurrection of Jesus, followed by its gradual decline and apostasy. And then from the Reformation onwards, a gradual restoration of apostolic truth occurred, in which the latest and last chapter was the Advent movement. I now move on to more recent historians, and I do recognise the level of presumption to which I aspire. As an Australian far removed from where most Adventist history has occurred, which is right here, also commenting on people alive, most of whom I have not met. So if you'll forgive that presumption, I will proceed. The practice of history in Adventism has changed considerably over 150 years, with crises and struggles over a growing emphasis on critical historical engagement by professionally trained historians, as they treat religious and secular history as well as the history of the Adventist movement. While there'd been a number of critics of the church prior to this period, none broke the mould of using history from a theological point of view. However, the development of a professional historical approach to issues began tentatively in the 1950s and gained momentum as university-educated historians took up positions of scholarship in Adventist institutions in the 1960s and 70s. From 1969, scholarly debate within the church found a platform through Spectrum, and it led to frequent debates over issues of historical import, debates that could take place perhaps a little more readily than in official, perhaps de facto imprimatur journals. Recent Adventist approaches to history demonstrate more awareness of the complexities of history. They are less likely to assume the perspective of God, and they're more open to alternative and non-linear explanations of events. However, these works are not uncontested, as lay people, some church administrators, and even some historians attempt to preserve the traditional approach to Adventist history, the God in history. This may come particularly as taking a professional historian approach may appear to be losing some of the values for which we've stood. The first serious critical scholarly analysis of Adventist history took place over the role of Ellen White beginning in the 1970s, with a cluster of articles in the autumn 1970 issue of Spectrum. Donald McAdams has produced a valuable overview of this debate, and he's traced the to and fro in the arguments and noted how they've ping-ponged backwards and forwards, essentially between taking an approach that was aware of the various debates and those who were perhaps trying to defend the kingdom. Frederick Harder of Andrews University wrote of Ellen White, "She was not writing history, she was interpreting it," adding that history was learned by ordinary means. that the activity of God in the historical situation was seen by revelation. And that basically set the platform for the debate for the next 10 years. McAdams noted that these debates, unlike the debates during Ellen White's time, were not aimed to tear down, but to understand. Writers like Ranson and Weiss wanted to make sure White was more influential, but insisted on objective scholarship and a critical examination of sources. The debate between William Peterson's critique of Ellen White's sources and, in particular, John Wood, who came to his defence, did degenerate into some personal reflections on both sides. And then was joined by Ronald Graybill's study, in which he suggested that perhaps neither side had the full picture. He found that she was not really a historian at all, but rather her quote was through Uriah Smith and was in pursuit of religious rather than historical goals. This was merely the opening skirmish. The more significant historiographical research to explode on the Adventist historical scene was the work of Ron Numbers. And he initiated a major shift with his seminal study of the health writings of Ellen White. Numbers refused any presuppositions about divine inspiration. He treated her works from a purely secular historical perspective, applying standard objective historical criteria. And he concluded that ideas that White claimed to have received purely through inspiration were in fact borrowed from concepts which were in currency at the time through the publication of popular health reform. Furthermore, he contended that Ellen White changed her ideas over time. He was able to trace that. And his major book, The Prophetess of Health, sent shockwaves through academic and administrative church circles. Time magazine commented on his book, while the Review and Herald tried to minimise the implications by editorialising that it did not challenge the faith of a mature Adventist. A number of respected Adventist scholars responded to his work, one calling it thoroughly researched and clearly written, a first-class piece of historical scholarship. Several Adventist historians took issue with minor parts of his work, but none challenged the fundamental basis of it. However, the debate was not always conducted in a gentlemanly manner, and it has rumbled on over the years, and Numbers has moved on from Adventism to a default agnostic point of view. Another significant Adventist historian of the time was Benjamin MacArthur, who made an important contribution to understanding the role of history within Adventism. His article, Where Are Historians Taking the Church?, published in Spectrum November 1979. He charted the rise of professional Adventist historians and saw the dilemma that came with that, as the enthusiastic amateurs of the early movement eventually and inevitably gave way to highly specialised scholars. He observed that historians are no longer the guardians of tradition, but rather have evolved into social critics. The historical methodologies they use are different from the historical approaches of earlier Adventist writers, leading to vastly different conclusions and, inevitably, some controversy. He made overt the problem for historians of faith which had emerged during the debate over Numbers' book, stating that the discipline's insistence on finding causal explanation within the temporal realm heightens the problem, for it seemingly counters the assumption that God acts directly in the affairs of humanity. And he noted that one of the problems for historians was that God's leading was not susceptible to historical methodology. I'm having to skip major parts of the argument for time. The third major historian I wish to consider here is that of Gary Land, one of the first professionally trained historians in the church, and one of the first to see himself as a researcher rather than just a teacher. And he's part of the group of historians who've taken a professional and critical approach to Adventist history, which has shaken up established notions. He admires much of the recent scholarship and recognises the need for more of it, for he sees history as being at the heart of Adventist identity. Like MacArthur, Land wrote a major article exploring the development of historiographical consciousness in Adventism. and he drew many similar conclusions. The main area of debate was clearly studies of Ellen White, where contributions were quite uneven in quality, which was hardly surprising considering the relatively confined academic world in which many of the participants moved, something which I think the Adventist Historians Association is doing a lot to address. Nevertheless, Land suggested that the existence of a debate in itself was healthy, prompting further scholarship which eventually delved into the realms of whether or not a distinctive Adventist approach to history could exist, which I believe will be addressed soon. This philosophical debate essentially turned on whether the rationale of all history should be illuminated by ecclesiastical history and not vice versa, as proposed by one conservative historian. Land pointed out that the traditional way of describing God's hand in history implied an almost deistic separation of God and the world, whereas the Bible presented God as both immanent and transcendent. This meant then that God is always active in history. But because in the light of Revelation some events are more meaningful than others, the Christian historian, rather than emphasising God's intervention, will seek to understand the meaning of events within a Christian framework. Land suggested that if we are to survive and make our research understood, we must be able to articulate the relationship between critical history and religious belief, calling on us as historians to engage theologians and denominational administrators in a dialogue about the meaning of our history and its implications for our beliefs and practices, something which he took to heart by writing a textbook on Adventist history. Another key historian has been Professor George Knight, who moved into historical research via education, particularly through his study of Ellen White and her educational philosophy. As a historian, he's written very extensively and has had perhaps more influence on the average Adventist thinking than most Adventist historians. He has bridged the gap between scholarly and popular publication. And he's actually taken up Land's challenge to make sure that we have a broader informed public about matters historical through his work. He demonstrates that a more nuanced understanding is compatible with a strengthening trust in the Church, especially for the growing numbers of highly educated Adventists. And he hopes that a better historical understanding can help heal some of the divisions within the Church. The last historian I wish to speak about is the late Dr. Arthur Patrick, who began his career as an academic and has had a significant influence on the shaping of Adventist historical thought. Like many others, he found a deeper respect for White through a clearer and more academically rigorous investigation of her life and work. He was particularly noted for the moderation with which he propounded his ideas and thus became the embodiment of that well-known phrase, a gentleman and a scholar. What Patrick brought to the debate was the capacity to lovingly and respectfully work alongside those who at times violently disagreed with him, a capacity that was evident in some of our early founders that we may have lost some of along the way. There is a need, he wrote, to hear actively the voices that derive from differing convictions, including the enthusiastic participants and affirmative supporters in fundamentalist evangelical and in particular Adventist circles. Other voices are also crucial, especially those of the ardent cautioners within each of these communions, who express concerns, formulate critiques and lay charges. However, the quest to understand will be helped most of all by the analysts who offer historical, biblical, theological, sociological and other interpretations that point beyond the partisanship of apologetics and the rhetoric of controversy towards a comprehensive understanding and constructive action. An example of the growing sophistication of Adventist historians has been the Ellen White Project, which began in 2009, demonstrating the capacity for Adventist historians to work in a complex manner, to engage with other historians outside of Adventism in order to produce a much clearer understanding of the work of Ellen White. So we can see the approach to history in Adventism has shifted significantly from using history as a given, as a received text in order to back up theological arguments, to one which is more aware of the complexities of history, more critical of sources, and more in line with what we expect of conventional historians to do. It is perhaps more sensitive to the difficulty of trying to trace the finger of God in human affairs, and I think therefore is extremely useful to us in the world we live in today.
We have copies of my paper that I've asked to be distributed, and I can go ahead and get those out. I recognize that I'm sandwiched between two presentations that take very broad looks at Adventist history from the 150 years perspective. I'm actually going to take a very short and very brief moment in Adventist history, one individual who's not even an Adventist, and to see how his work was used by Adventists in the first 15 years of Adventist self-identity. As Professor Reynaud has already said, Adventist historiography has been principally focused on the relationship between prophecy and history. William Miller might have claimed that he used only the Bible to let the Bible be its own interpreter, but Miller was an heir of the historical method of interpreting prophecy that was inconceivable without the historical record. One of the central pillars of that method was the identification of a sequence of empires that dominated the world of the Bible. Sometimes Adventists have been so keen to identify and describe the sequence of empires as a fulfillment of prophecy, they fail to consider what the category of an empire is all about. In 1846, Charles Beecher, in a series of sermons preached in Fort Wayne, Indiana, took a broader view of history and suggested that there were elements of the imperial system that threatened the Christian church from within. He sought to warn the church from taking even one step towards the apostasy that would occur if it were to adopt that system. At least for Adventists, the beginning of the imperial systems was described in Genesis as Babel, and that system formed the central concern of the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation. Adventists taught that the sequence of metals in Daniel 2 and the sequence of beasts in Daniel 7, 8, and Revelation described the continuity of the imperial system from Babylon, through Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, to the final remaining absolute monarchy in existence, the papacy. I would argue that Beecher describes four constitutive elements that run like a thread through all of these empires. First of all, a centralized authority. Second, a hierarchical bureaucracy. Third, a demand for conformity. And fourth, coercion. Certainly there are other elements in empires, such as military forces and territory under control, but I see in Beecher these are the four constitutive elements, those that are kind of most basic. It's clear that Beecher and the early Sabbath-keeping Adventists were alarmed at any attempt to develop in the church a centralized authority supported by a hierarchy that demanded conformity with the threat of punishment. Before going further, though, we need to give some background. Charles Beecher, the son of Lyman Beecher, had 12 siblings, among whom were Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Beechers were New School Presbyterians, meaning that they were part of the faction of the Presbyterian Church that advocated revival and human accountability for their actions. Charles Beecher came to age at a time of high conflict between the New School and the Old School. In fact, his father was tried in 1835 for heresy, hypocrisy, and slander, being specifically charged with pretending to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, but actually undermining it with New School interpretations. Charles Beecher was 29 when he experienced conversion while living with his brother Henry in Indianapolis. Henry proposed that he take up the ministry in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Charles agreed, but arrived at Fort Wayne in May of 1844 to discover that an old school preacher had taken his place as the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. With help from his brother Henry and his father Lyman, Charles started a new school Presbyterian church, nurtured its growth to an attendance of about 200 people, and set out to build a new church building. At the dedication of that building on February 22, 1846, he preached 2 sermons on the theme, "The Bible, a Sufficient Creed." In the first 15 years of the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, Beecher's second sermon was quoted or referenced or referred to 11 times, sometimes extensively, pages and pages of Beecher's sermon. Some of this material was used by Ellen White in The Great Controversy, and what I intend to do in this paper is to review Beecher's arguments and show how they were used and extended by early Sabbath-keeping Adventists. Beecher's first sermon is an expository treatment of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Beecher's sermon focuses on how the man of God may be perfect. But for him, being perfect is not a matter of individual sinlessness. Rather, he interprets perfection in this verse as synonymous with being thoroughly furnished unto all good works. And by the way, all the capital letters in this paper come from Beecher. Thus, the sermon states 4 things. The Bible alone furnishes the man of God with the doctrines, the reproofs, the corrections, and instructions needed for personal holiness and practical morality. Beecher concludes his first sermon by claiming that the principles he has expounded are not just Protestantism, but the foundation of all Christianity. He affirms that the Bible, as God wrote it, with every man his own interpreter, every man responsible only to God, is the rule and only teacher. The Bible is the means whereby all truth is inculcated, all errors extirpated, all discipline enforced, and all holiness attained. It was Beecher's second sermon, though, that captured early Adventists' attention. In it, Beecher propounded the thesis that the substitution of any other creed for any of these purposes being doctrines, reproof, corrections, instructions, the substitution of any creed for any of these purposes is one step in apostasy. Surprisingly, he begins by defending the efforts to systematize doctrines and publish them in book form. That is not the substitution he's referring to. Nor is it the claim that one of these systems is the only system taught in the Bible. He finds that claim presumptuous, but not his chief concern. Rather, he argues that when a church goes beyond claiming to have in its book the system of truth taught in the Bible, and that church then requires the acceptance of that book by every candidate for licensure or ordination as a test of his qualification, that church is taking one step in apostasy. Beecher argues that the requirement that ministers accept a creed is a direct contradiction to the teaching of the Holy Spirit in 2 Timothy 3. According to him, the church of his day virtually declares that the man of God who adopts the Bible is not perfect unless he also adopts a creed. According to Beecher, this is analogous to what the Roman apostasy does. Rome does not deny Christ, nor does it deny that he is the mediator. What she does is to add other mediators, the virgins and the saints. According to Protestants, this is the very essence of Rome's apostasy on this point. So, Protestants on the road to apostasy do not deny the Bible, nor do they deny that it is perfect for some specified purposes. What Protestants teach is that only the person who receives and adopts the Bible and this creed is perfect. Beecher next draws another analogy to Roman teaching. He argues that the worship of the saints arose not by the encouragement of bold, bad men, but by the backing of pious and decent men seeking to respect the memory of the martyrs. This initial impulse to honor martyrs received the endorsements of good men with good motives, but it passed beyond its initial stage to the horrid consummation of saint worship. Beecher asserts that the same thing happened with fasting from meats, forbidding to marry, and all the other features of the Romish apostasy. He contends that in precisely the same manner, Protestant apostasy is creeping stealthily through its first innocent stages among good men from good motives, and will pass beyond his day into a similar consummation. In words quoted by Uriah Smith, John Loughborough, and Ellen White, Beecher says, "Our best, most humble, most devoted servants of Christ are fostering in their midst what will one day, not long hence, show itself to be of the spawn of the dragon. They shrink from any rude word against creeds with the same sensitiveness with which those holy fathers would have shrunk from a rude word against the rising veneration of saints and martyrs, which they were fostering." Beecher and his Adventist followers would probably have agreed with the sentiment that the road to apostasy is always paved with good intentions. Beecher argues that the practice of adding a creed to the Bible is a feature of Romanism revived under a Protestant form. According to Beecher, the voice of history tells of the Roman claim to have the sole right of interpreting the Bible arose first by creed making. Beginning in the 2nd century, the creed-making power crept slowly and stealthily forward until it was first exercised in a general council in the 4th century and afterwards found itself centered in the Vatican. Beecher says that the first step was the making of an authoritative creed to which the clergy were compelled to subscribe. The last step was the absolute prohibition of the Bible to the people. It implies that there's a slippery slope from one to the other. Beecher calls on the facts of history to document that the early church had no creed. Even the Apostles' Creed, which he correctly states was not made by the apostles, was never used as a test. And Beecher then takes this moment to clarify an especially crucial point. In his argument, in this argument, he says, creed means not articles of belief, but articles made authoritative tests. In this, he's in line with other anti-creedalists who did not object to creating a list to describe the beliefs, but strenuously objected to using those tests to prescribe beliefs. The idea of such tests, Beecher contends, was borrowed from the political world by the Greeks, who were versed in such features of civil administration. The idea of an authoritative creed is therefore exclusively political. It is not of Christian parentage. Church councils consolidated the local churches into a political union and formed a hierarchy. This happened gradually until AD 325, when the first general council was called and the first general creed was made. Beecher asks, who called this council? Was it by the authority of Christ or the church? No, it was called by the absolute political power of the Roman emperor, who was not even a member of the Christian church. According to Beecher, Nicaea fully settled the doctrines of the Bible, which of course it did not, but Beecher says that, banished Arius and compelled his followers to subscribe to the creed. After this, creeds multiplied in swarms, creating and fomenting those very divisions they were designed to suppress. Thus, Beecher argues creeds, as authoritative tests, are a political idea introduced into the Christian church under a Roman emperor's mandate. What was the argument that supported the creed-making power? Beecher says they were these. Truth is one. Therefore, true believers cannot differ. But they do differ. Therefore, there is heresy. Heresy must be kept out. Make a creed to keep it out. And as to which side is heresy, well, what has been believed everywhere, always by all. That is, heresy is the opinion which is in the minority. Yes, shear off the troublesome thinkers and sing stagnant hallelujahs, this by way of keeping the church pure. You can almost hear Beecher preaching this. Beecher finds Protestants using the same arguments. We must keep the denomination pure. We must keep out heresy. Beecher cites as an example that when the Westminster Assembly formed the Confession and Catechism, the Scots commissioners wanted the members of that body to subscribe to the shorter catechism. According to Beecher, the proposal was rejected after discussion as an unwarrantable imposition. However, within 40 years, subscription to the catechism was made a test of ministerial standing. Beecher next turns his attention to the clergy Another statement quoted by 3 different authors in the early Review and Herald, Beecher states, the creed system is now exerting upon the clergy of the Protestant churches a secret, unsuspected, but tremendous power against the Bible, a power of fear. Yes, while it professes to venerate and defend the Bible, it is virtually undermining it. As evidence, Beecher describes how Protestant ministers must subscribe to a denominational creed in order to be licensed. The Protestant denominations have made it certain that a man cannot become a preacher at all, anywhere, without accepting some book besides the Bible. The denominations say that they are not inflicting a penalty on potential ministers by requiring them to subscribe to a creed, Beecher acknowledges. They say they only decline to receive into their ranks those who do not agree with them. Beecher calls this argument not only specious, but the most consummate stroke of infernal craft and double-distilled Jesuitism. Try to bottle that. The denominations may claim that requiring subscription doesn't do the candidates any harm, but in fact it silently leaves a candidate who will not subscribe to the creed to his inevitable fate. And that fate is to be silently and invisibly crushed dead in the religious world that might license and hire him. Beecher feels compelled to explain that the final form of apostasy will not come from Rome, with the Pope's long arm outstretched to snatch our Bibles, nor by crosses, processions, and baubles. Apostasy never comes from the outside, it develops. It is an apostasy that shall spring into life within us, an apostasy that shall martyr a man who believes his Bible ever so holily. In another statement quoted by Ellen White in The Great Controversy, Beecher argues that there is nothing imaginary in the statement that the creed power is now beginning to prohibit the Bible as really as Rome did, though in a subtler way. During the time Protestant ministers are in training, they see before them an authorized statement of what they must find in the Bible or be martyred. In a passage quoted 4 times in the Review and Herald, Beecher asks, is that freedom of opinion? The liberty wherewith Christ maketh us free? Rome would have given that. Every one of her clergy might have studied the Bible to find there the pontifical creed on pain of death. Was that liberty? The Adventists were concerned with that liberty. According to Beecher, the whole boasted liberty of the theological seminarian consists of a choice of chains. Will he wear the Presbyterian handcuff or the Methodist, Baptist, or Episcopal or Evangelical handcuff? As a result, the ministers dare not study their Bibles. There is something criminal in saying anything new. It is shocking to utter words that have not the mold of age upon them. As a result, through the ministry, the same spirit has been conducted to the people. Any departure from the creed is seized upon to make political capital. Beecher analyzes what has happened to the denominations. Houses must be built, salaries must be raised. This requires wealth. Wealth requires numbers and patronage. This creates a servile dread of novelty, for everything that another party can get a hold of strikes at the gold. Therefore the people watch their minister, and the minister is afraid of his people. Oh, woeful day! Oh, unhappy Church of Christ! Fast rushing round and round the fatal circle of absorbing ruin which he has just described. Thou sayest, I am rich and increased in goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art poor and miserable and blind and naked. The Laodicean message. Writers in the Review and Herald use the final portion of this quotation 5 times as evidence that the Protestant churches truly were apostate. Ellen White uses a couple of the next paragraphs to illustrate the future direction of the Protestant church in America. The evangelical denominations are not only formed within a climate of merely human fear, they live and move and breathe in a state of things radically corrupt and appealing every hour to every baser element of their nature, to hush up the truth and to bow the knee to the power of apostasy. All this has happened so stealthily, nobody knows how, among good men out of good motives. Beecher asks, as does Ellen White, was not this the way things went with Rome? Are we not living her life over again? And what do we see just ahead? Another general council, a World's Convention, Evangelical Alliance, and Universal Creed. Beecher concludes his second sermon with both apocalyptic and aquatic imagery. The waves are coming, the waves of the coming conflict are beginning to be felt. They will convulse Christendom to her center. The deep heavings begin to swell beneath us. Thunders mutter in the distance. Winds moan across the surging bosom of the deep. All things betide the rising of that final storm of divine indignation which shall sweep away the vain refuge of lies. Beecher's own congregants were thrilled with the sermons, and they arranged for them to be published. Other members of the New School Presbytery of Fort Wayne were troubled by their message. Beecher's fellow ministers made an appointment with him to express what they considered to be his misapprehension of the views and practices of the Presbyterian Church. At the conclusion of the interview, they decided not to press charges of heresy against him. However, they did file a report that expressed their opinion that some of his views were subversive of all order in the house of God. Charles remained at the church in Fort Wayne until 1850, when he moved back east. Beecher's sermon suggests a broad view of historical developments. For him, the Protestant opposition to Roman Catholicism was as much to its Romanness as to its Catholicism. Evidence for this is found in the fact that Beecher uses the word Catholic only once, while he uses the word Rome and its derivatives 17 times. He never puts the words Roman and Catholic together. Beecher is not impressed with the claims to Catholicity, but his deeper concern is with the Roman origin of the creed-making power. The Roman emperor used his authority to call a council, to finalize the last stages of the development of a church hierarchy, wrote a creed, and then demanded conformity to it by a threat of coercion. In its adoption of an imperial Roman system, Beecher sees the church's original apostasy, and he warned that a similar imperial system in the Protestant churches would bring another apostasy in his day. Sabbath-keeping Adventists used Beecher's ideas as evidence that the American Protestantism had already imbibed the wine of the imperial system and was already apostate. John Loughborough explicitly cites Beecher as a source for his description of how the image of the beast would be formed. He argues that the process whereby the Roman beast developed out of the pagan Roman dragon was the same process the image of the beast would develop under the influence of the lamb-like beast, which represented the United States. What can we say then about the historiography of Beecher and the early Adventists? First, it was Protestant in that it affirmed the basic Reformation beliefs and the authority of the Bible. And second, it's apparent that Charles Beecher and the early Sabbath-keeping Adventists also viewed history from an eschatological perspective. They believed that the knowledge of the past enabled them to see and be warned of future dystopian developments. From the seeds of imperial creed-making evident from Nicaea to his time, Beecher would see a worldwide conference enforcing a common creed even in Protestantism. Adventists saw even more. From the rejection of the Seventh-day Sabbath in the early church and its replacement in Christian creeds, the Sunday, they saw worldwide apostasy from God's law, the enforcement of unbiblical Sunday observance in America, and finally the persecution of true Sabbath keepers with all the ensuing events leading up to the second coming of Jesus. Sabbath-keeping Adventists were also deeply concerned about their own body of believers as they contemplated organizing 150 years ago. They did not want their movement to follow the imperial way of Babylon. Some opposed organization because they equated it with the adoption of Babylonianism. Only when it was clear that organization did not involve making of a creed as a test of fellowship were they willing to take the first steps in adopting gospel order. As they organized their church, they wanted to be sure they did not follow the imperial system of Babylon and take the first steps in apostasy.
Thank you for those papers, and I bring you greetings from the cold and snowy wasteland of Michigan. It was quite a trek getting here yesterday, and I didn't get into my hotel until well after midnight last night. I was just thankful to be here. I think 95% of the flights were canceled out of O'Hare, and mine managed to slip through. So I have a paper entitled Naked in the Garden of the Past, Is There a Seventh-day Adventist Philosophy of History? And I'll open by sharing the quote from which the title is taken, it's by Edward Carr in What is History, written in 1961, commenting on 19th century historians in general. And he said this: "Historians walked in the Garden of Eden without a scrap of philosophy to cover them, naked and unashamed before the God of history. Since then, we have known sin and experienced a fall." Conventional historical wisdom describes the evolution of church history as proceeding from a providentialist, confessional outlook to one that is based on an objective, critical, detached view on the past. While modern scholars generally agree that pure objectivity is impossible, most historians retain the modernist propensity to believe that personal biases and prejudices should be bracketed as far as humanly possible, especially religious ones. Often, it seems, the mark of truly modern history is the embrace of a philosophical, methodological naturalism. This philosophy, it is at times argued, will limit the historian to natural as opposed to supernatural causes, and cause her to use empirical observation and critical inquiry to examine, interrogate, and organize historical sources. This philosophically self-aware critical distancing allows the historian, in Carr's evocative quote above, to move away from the Edenic naivete of believing in a natural epistemological objectivity, where one can simply collect facts from the past and arrange them in self-evident array, as was described as being an early version of Adventist historiography. The fallen historian, in Carr's account, is aware of his own biases and inclinations, as well as those of his sources, and will achieve some level of critical engagement and analysis of this. The knowledge of our sin will cause us to compensate for it with the tools of critical history, and we can engage with a version of history that is largely cleansed from our personal biases and superstitions. Adventist historian Gary Land, in probably the most complete and helpful overview of Adventist historiography to date, until our good professor here perhaps publishes his paper, which I found very helpful. And we cover some similar ground. Dr. Reynaud, a more comprehensive overview of historiography, and my paper is going to attempt to ask and suggest an answer to the question of what is left in this story of unfolding historiography. Where do Adventists now stand in comparison with our pioneers and in comparison with modernist historical approaches? Anyway, Gary Land wrote an article tracing the evolution of Adventist history writing. He notes the shift from memoirs, apologetics, and storybooks written in a providentialist framework to the, quote, emergence of a scholarly approach to the Adventist past in recent years. Land describes the emergence of a sense of professional scholarly history in Adventism as coinciding with the rise of Spectrum magazine in the 1970s, much as Dr. Reynaud suggested here, where a number of scholars began to look more critically at Ellen White's writings. In a series of Spectrum articles that were well described earlier, questions were raised about her use of sources, as well as her intellectual and social milieu and her own intellectual development. These early efforts to engage more critically with Mrs. White were generally resisted, according to Land, by the White estate. Matters really came to a head with the publication in 1976 of Ron Number's Prophetess of Health, a study of Ellen G. White. Land notes in his preface to his work that Numbers revealed that he, quote, did not presuppose inspiration or ignore witnesses who rejected Ellen White as inspired, close quote. I think that Land was actually being rather optimistic or generous in his assessment of Numbers' position. What Dr. Numbers actually wrote was that, quote, I have tried to be as objective as possible. Thus I have refrained from using divine inspiration as a historical explanation, close quote. So rather than merely not, quote, presupposing inspiration, as Land suggests, Numbers actually presupposed the opposite, that inspiration was not a possible explanation. Once this assumption regarding the non-reality of inspiration was in place, I would suggest everything else in Dr. Number's book inevitably followed. Suddenly, rather than just not ignoring witnesses who questioned or rejected Mrs. White's inspiration, these witnesses become, by definition, the tellers of truth about her work. Because inspiration is not an accepted category, her life had to be explained through some sort of psychological explanations. Professor Numbers and his wife, who was a clinical psychologist, proposed a, quote, somatization disorder with an accompanying histrionic personality style, previously known as hysteria, as one explanation. Mrs. White's visions, quote, shrink to mere epiphenomena, close quote, and are ultimately explained as, quote, self-hypnotic episodes. In a paradoxical flip, Professor Numbers tries to correct the Adventist story that assumed the truth of the prophet and her supporters with a story that assumed the falsity of her central claims and assumed the truth of her opponents. I would propose that rather than a move to objectivity, it was in reality a move to an alternate competing ideology and apologetic of methodological naturalism. Now, in discussing the Numbers episode, Land, in my opinion, overlooks Numbers' underlying commitment to a closed materialistic outlook. Land concludes that Numbers' book, quote, made clear the problem that, quote, the church could not live easily with attempts to understand Adventism, particularly Ellen White, within its historical context and on the basis of critically re-examined and more extensive documentation. But this is to misstate, or at least to understate, the church's problem with the approach that Professor Numbers was proposing. It is true that most religious bodies exist in uneasy tension with attempts at close historical scrutiny of the context and culture of their origins. This is simply an unavoidable byproduct, in my opinion, of the epistemological tensions found at the borders of faith and reason. Adventists and any other faith communities that believe in divine revelation must wrestle with the contours of this boundary. We certainly have not always handled that tension perfectly or ideally. There is much for historians and other scholars to critique and propose in seeking a more faithful balance between these two worlds and ways of knowing. But Professor Numbers is asking for far more than this. If it were just a case of taking historical context more seriously and examining documents more closely and critically, most Adventist historians that I know would have no objection. Indeed, this is what most of us aspire to. But to abandon or deny the category of divine inspiration, and by extension any category of the supernatural, is something that Adventist historians simply cannot do and remain Adventist or even Christian historians. Now, Professor Numbers may well respond that Adventist historians have to choose then between their faith and their church, between their faith and church and their profession, at least when they're carrying out their profession. But there are many very good practicing historians working at both religious and secular universities that would differ with this. They would argue that Professor Numbers' position is one that equally involves faith commitments to a metaphysical framework that is no less religious than the one he seeks to escape from. I'm going to skip over a section on British philosopher of history and Oxford professor R.G. Collingwood, who in a very profound argument talks about the problems of using inductive methods of empirical examination to make hard and fast and absolutist claims or rules about examining the past that methodological naturalism uses, and I can give you the paper for you to look at that closely. I'm going to move on in the interest of time to more recently a professor of mine at the University of Notre Dame, Bradley Gregory, who taught at Stanford University before moving to Notre Dame, has critiqued the secular critical approach to history because of its usual manner of reducing religion to purely secular, non-transcendent categories. Gregory writes that in this method, religion has to be reducible to some combination of humanly constructed phenomena because there is nothing else for it to be. Having denied a possible category of divine inspiration, visions then cannot be anything other than one's socially constructed desires and ambitions visually invoked in some kind of self-hypnotic trance. This use of only secular categories, Gregory notes, is itself a faith approach. As he puts it, quote, The reductionist study of religion has paradoxically produced a new form of confessional history, a secular confessional history. There are two problems for the Christian historian with the secular confessional history that, under the guise of neutrality and objectivity, actually promotes, quote, a metaphysically naturalistic, materialistic, and indeed atheistic approach to religion. The first problem is that it prevents historians from understanding religious people on their own terms. If religious people are motivated by religion, and there are good evidences that they are, as especially seen in martyrdom, then we will never understand them or get them right historically if we reduce those beliefs to something else. Second, we have merely replaced one faith system with another, one that tends to be under-examined and less critically held than other faith systems. This is because secular faith has so permeated the academy that it is taken as background reality, just the way things are. There is a third problem with this secular confessional history for Adventist historians that Gregory does not mention. That because of our relatively recent origins as Adventists and our prophetic heritage, supernatural events and categories are much closer to our working world than for most historians. To eschew or abandon supernatural causation is to make it almost impossible to work as believing historians on the history that should be nearest and dearest to us, our own church. It is in many ways especially incumbent on us as Adventist Christian scholars to articulate a principled pathway that allows us to speak both to the Academy as scholarly historians and to our church as faithful historians. Thus far, I have been most concerned with the threat to Adventist history and identity by the secular confessional left, but there is an equally problematic threat from an uncritical fideist confessional right. Uncritical fideism threatens to unmoor the church's history from that of both larger Christian and Western history and to place it in a kind of alternate historical reality to which non-Adventists have no connection. This may heighten our collective sense of uniqueness and special identity, but it will severely hamper our outreach and apologetic efforts. If allowed to flourish, fideist history will cause us to lose common ground in bridge-building context with outsiders. We are already seeing this kind of special insider history gaining ground in conservative church circles. Videos and DVDs of conspiracy views of history, filled with fantastic and absurd claims about history being controlled by tiny elite groups such as the Masons or the Illuminati and Jesuits, have a cult-like following in certain church circles. It's broader than we as historians would like to think. This problem of fantastic insider history is not unique to the Adventist church, but has plagued the church ever since the Gnostic gospel stories of Christ animating clay birds and punishing playmates. The miracles of the martyrs and saints of the early church and Middle Ages contained much that the Protestant reformers recognized to be fantastic and fictional. Of course, they sorted these stories out by religious affiliation or doctrinal orthodoxy. If you held to false beliefs, then your stories must not be true. But the modern church views these criteria as a form of special pleading and allows that God can work, indeed must work, through imperfect, doctrinally errant human beings. So the challenge remains, what philosophy of history can Adventist historians maintain that will allow for the possibility of genuine miracles and inspiration, but will maintain principled boundaries against fantastic and fideist histories that isolate the church from the real world and open its members to deceptive teachings? Is there any one approach that can accomplish this goal? Or may it be necessary for Adventist historians to use a complementary array of philosophical approaches depending on for whom they are writing? The remainder of this paper will attempt to set out a spectrum of approaches that are available for Adventist historians to consider as they carry out their work. Now, as I'm nearing the end of my time, what I'm choosing to do is summarize the rest of my paper in relation to the handout that you've now received from my erstwhile colleagues. And what this is an attempt to do is to show that, in fact, there are other categories. I've discussed two extreme categories, have I not? A kind of closed secular confessional approach, which I argue is not appropriate for Christian historians, or really any historians who are wanting to be fair to the worldviews of others, and then a closed fideist confessional view, which is similarly inappropriate, though for different reasons. But I would suggest that there are at least 3 other positions open to us. This chart that you're looking at sets these out in some detail. Those of you who are interested in a greater discussion, I can email a copy of my paper to you. But just to briefly describe this, we have a spectrum running from left to right, moving, if you will, from a greater use of general revelation to more reliance on special revelation. And there are categories of history, I argue, that Adventists can use because, in fact, there have been trails blazed by other Christian historians. Some of my mentors at the University of Notre Dame, George Marsden, Mark Knoll, Nathan Hatch, have worked in what I would call open critical history that uses primarily materialistic categories in a critical way, but does not deny transcendent or non-material causes. And religion is a meaningful causative feature of human existence. So you have George Marsden in his book on Jonathan Edwards, Mark Knoll, America's God, looking at history primarily from a materialistic way, but not seeking to explain everything that happens and not denying the possibility of outside causes, but not seeking to highlight them or prove their existence. That is next to this third category, the critical apologetic, which uses, again, primarily materialistic or even exclusively materialistic categories, but to overtly argue for the reality and value of certain transcendent or non-material categories. It also takes religion as theology seriously. So we have Richard Bushman, his Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, which was a widely read, Bushman being a Columbia University historian, widely respected, writes a biography of Joseph Smith's life with all the supernatural color in it, not passing judgment on it, but clearly in the way he's writing it, promoting it, and hoping that the reader will take it seriously. I put Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation here, not because he relies on miracles, but he's clearly making a larger ideological claim about the Catholic's Church and its positive impact on history. And then there's a fourth category, critical confessional history, which still uses, criticizes sources, looking at them to evaluate their bias, doesn't just accept Adventist sources because they're Adventist, and yet is open to using transcendent categories and causes guided by confessional revealed sources to explain history and reality. This is where historian and theologian are become inseparable. And yet there are very fine historians that work in this category. I would show you Mark Knoll, Christ in the Life of the Mind, George Marsden, The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship, where they take particular Christian doctrines and say, how does these doctrines affect our approach to history? And it's really only fellow believers that can fully appreciate the insights or fully appreciate the doctrinal claims, though even unbelievers or non-believers can critique, in fact, the usefulness that these bring to understanding history. So the argument or the idea that I leave you with is that depending on your audience, it will depend on which category is used here, and that as Adventist historians, we have at least two audiences. We have a church to speak to, and we need to be able to engage in this category number 4, or other highly less responsible individuals will do that, and they are doing it. And they are, if we are so focused on being in only category 2 or maybe category 3, this very important ground will be taken over by the Walter Weitz and the like of the world, who are very happy to explain history to our co-religionists. And so we need to occupy that territory, but we also need to speak to the larger scholarly world in these categories 2 and 3. And it's not speculative that we can do this. Other Christian historians have done it and have done it well. And so I would argue have some Adventist historians, and I commend you to do it yourself. Thank you for your time.
In Nick Miller's terms, that perhaps you're suggesting it seems a trajectory from number 5 to number 2 on the grid. Ed, Alan, and Dan's papers both were very interesting, I thought, in showing the way that other historiographies and approaches shaped early Adventist historians and histories. And I think perhaps Nick's paper at the end picks that up in a sense by considering how we as historians today should interact with other historiographies and historiographical approaches. So I think the three papers complement each other nicely, and thank you to all three speakers. So, questions? And if I could ask, use the microphone. You just press the big red button in front of you. It's quite straightforward. Just remember to turn it off when you finish speaking, and if you could identify yourself and where you're from when you speak. And if you could all do that throughout the day. Thank you.
Doug Morgan, Washington Adventist University. I wanted to ask Ed if you saw anything in Charles Beecher's work about the slavery issue. Did he bring that into his critique of Protestants?
Beecher, of course, was one of the sources for Uncle Tom's Cabin, his sister's blockbuster novel that caused the Civil War. In this particular work that I looked at, he did not mention slavery, but Adventists, in the same paragraph that they quote Beecher, do use slavery as an example of how America is acting in an imperial way.
George Gibson from Union College. Since Ron's in the audience, I'm hoping he will respond.
I don't know, I didn't recognize Ron in any of these papers.
Well, please say a bit more about that. I think it would be appropriate to hear from you on that, having been, as it were, if not attacked, at least certainly discussed.
I'll just point out one irony. I see that.
Sorry, if you could identify yourself for those who don't know you.
Ron Numbers, but I don't have my light on. Okay. I was fascinated by the categories in Nick's chart here. I see that I'm thrown in with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, which surprises me. Fawn Brodie, yeah. I can understand that a little bit more. But I also deserve to be in the third category. Because, as Gary would be the first to tell you if you ask him, I produced Adventism in America. That reflects my philosophy. And because of the politics of the early 70s, I handed the written volume over to Gary to prepare for publication by Erdman's. So Adventism in America could as easily reflect my philosophy of history as Prophet is of Hell. So knowing that, where would you put me?
A fair question, and I would
Press the button, but don't hold it down.
I see. Okay. I would put Hitchens and Dawkins in a category 0, and agree that you're not in the same category as them. I think Fawn Brodie is a fairer comparison.
Yeah, I do too.
The Adventism in America was primarily an edited collection, wasn't it?
Right. I organized it, picked the authors, and went through the first drafts with the authors. And so it reflects what I saw then as a good, I try to be objective. I know I can't be. I try to be a good person. I know I never will be. But I don't say, okay, I'm going to be an evil person because I can't be a good person. So just objectivity is a goal for me, not a place where I'll ever be. I'm not trying to take anything away from Gary, because he did all the last preparation and indexing and stuff like that for Erdmann's, but the whole scheme of that volume I had done. And so I would like to say that reflects my philosophy of history.
Yeah, this isn't meant to be a category of people, it's a category of works, right? So if you'll notice, Mark Knoll and Marsden are in 3 categories across, right? And so I would say that the work on Adventism in America falls in category 3, and you're able to contribute in that area, but the presuppositions of Prophetess of Health were somewhat different, it seems to me, and would put it in a category 1.
I only said, as Gary has pointed out, that I was not going to use supernaturalism as a historical explanation, which is what most evangelical historians and scientists do. They don't say, and then God did this, or Satan did this, and it doesn't say anything about their theological presuppositions. You might infer something from it, but and the same is true of Adventism in America. I believe you will not find any appeals to the supernatural in it.
But there's a difference, I believe, between a category 1 and a category 2. You're right, and I acknowledge that George Marsden, for instance, didn't invoke supernatural categories in Jonathan Edwards, but neither did he deny them, and he certainly leaves the possibility open. He doesn't look for exhaustive explanations.
Have you read the paperback edition of his History of Fuller?
I've read his History of Fuller. I'm not sure if it was
But the
hardback or
second
paperback.
edition, he explicitly invokes supernatural. That's the first time I've seen George do that. So, you know, I think you're right. George, Richard Bushman, Brad Gregory. I'm not sure I can name any more. So you said that many historians. Those are the 3 that I would think of first.
Knoll, Gregory, Marsden, Hatch. I mean, there's a. If you go to the
I've never seen it in Hatch. I don't think I've ever seen in the historical writings of Mark Knoll appeals to supernaturalism.
If I could just come in here, I would say if we look outside the field of American history and broaden it somewhat, I think it might be some interesting points of comparison. And also, I think if I might suggest sort of trying to define the categories a little more clearly, it's one thing to invoke and say, well, God did this, but then it's another to rule out the supernatural. And I'm thinking now of Alec Ryrie in particular, an historian of early modern British Reformation, who in his latest book specifically engages, which is about what does it mean to be a Puritan in the 16th century, says, well, a huge part of this life is prayer. Do we simply rule out the possibility that the prayer is doing any good? No, you can't do that. You can't ascribe things to it. But so I think perhaps there needs to be a more finer calibration of this between a supernaturalism that simply rules out the supernatural as an explanatory factor and an approach that says, well, we just won't engage with the supernatural at all. I just put that to you. Hand at the back.
Yes, I'm Carl Wilcox, and I'm from Texas. These categories are fascinating, of course, but they're really rhetorical categories. They do not actually represent, as I think Dr. Numbers has pointed out, a clear guide to the actual internal beliefs of a given author. So this raises a further problem. If you are a sincere believer, a true believer, as a Seventh-day Adventist, such as myself, a conservative to the nth degree, is it in fact appropriate for me to move between these categories? Or do I somehow betray myself and my beliefs when I move from critical confessional to closed secular confessional? And I, in fact, have done this in good conscience. Red Papers published an article in which I assume a closed secular confessional. Well, in fact, my motive for the paper was entirely closed fideist confessional, category 5. I can't pronounce the middle word. But You see my point. If we are wise as serpents and harmless as doves, without any ulterior motives, we should be able to move between these categories depending upon the audience we address.
I think it would be difficult for a Christian to operate in a closed secular confessional because it implies an attempt to explain what you would consider to be supernatural in purely naturalistic terms. It implies that, in fact, there is a denial of something supernatural, and I don't think a Christian could in good conscience do that. But the other categories, 2, 3, and 4, I think are all open.
So you're saying category 1 involves an explicit denial?
Well, it would be, I mean, I think that Dr. Numbers, when he says, I'm not going to allow for the category of inspiration, says I'm therefore going to have to find Ellen White has to have had hypnotic trances, or he needed, it seems to me, you were consistent with your underlying presupposition in needing to find a purely naturalistic, materialistic explanation.
I think you're distorting the whole history of so-called methodological naturalism, which was put into play, you might know, by evangelical Christians in the 80s. They popularized it. The term actually had been used a few times beforehand. It came out in the Christian Scholars Review by a professor at Wheaton College. And it was the methodological approach recommended to evangelical scholars in science and other areas. Not because it denied the supernatural, but because it bracketed the supernatural. So that Christian scientists could participate in the broader world of science without saying anything about their philosophical or metaphysical presuppositions. So now it's come to be criticized by the Discovery Institute and the intelligent design movement, which has now spilled over a little bit into the historical profession. But it was never from the beginning ever meant to represent a denial of the supernatural, just the opposite.
Well, Dr. Numbers, I do want to comment on that, please.
All right, if you could keep it short, because I would like to move.
It will be very brief. What the version of history that I'm critiquing was popularized by F.H. Bradley back in 1874. And if you read the section on my paper by Collingwood, this anti-supernaturalist approach is decisively critiqued by him. This is 100 years older than anything that was happening at Wheaton and elsewhere, and is not originated by Christians, but is, in interest of time, you can read my paper if you're interested.
I'm just saying that in that paper, that's when this term was put into play, and as an aid to evangelicals, not as a denial of evangelicalism.
Well, we've had a good debate, which is always good for an historical conference. I have a question I'd like to pose to Dr. Reynaud, so that we don't only tax Dr. Miller in the Q&A. You traced the trajectory that you identified, but there's a huge, and I realize the pressure of time doesn't allow you to do justice, but you do sort of take a great leap between A.T. Jones and Gary Land. Is there no critical Adventist history in that sort of 70 plus years? Is Gary Land the first, or are there others that you would see as his predecessors?
I have not tried to be comprehensive. I've tried to be more representative. I'm sure there are a good number of historians who might feel somewhat piqued that their name doesn't appear in the paper, and I think with some justice.
Could I address that for a minute?
Yes.
I find today, to me, is...
Sorry, can you identify...
Again, George Gibson Union College. I find it fascinating because, and I like that broad sweep, but to me, Ed brings up a fascinating point, and that is early Adventists were quite willing to read outside the Adventist church. We're very open to discussion. That didn't mean, and Ed can really expand on that, but didn't mean they necessarily agreed. They quote both favorably and they disagree. And to have Bill sitting here, who wrote an excellent editorial, say it's all right to read sources outside the Adventist church, for which I commend him for writing that. Just quickly, a brief history. Dr. Everett Dick wrote his dissertation on William Miller. The church did not like that. That shows to me we kind of went down from that early position. They strongly, I would say very strongly, recommended that he get his hands out of religious history. To my surprise, Dr. Dick took that very kindly and wrote, as most of you well know, became an outstanding frontier historian. But nonetheless, he talked to me many times about that. Even Froome, who was, because he was ordained and therefore could write about Adventist history, would call Dr. Dick to get information so he could include it, but Dr. Dick wasn't supposed to write about it. Anyway, I think we have, the sheer fact we can sit in a room and I appreciate Ron coming to our conference at Union and to discuss this, I think means that we're coming back to what I perceive to be a good thing, and that's where we're willing to engage history on a broad sweep and be able to say here's what we like or don't necessarily agree with, and that means there's going to be disagreement among us, but that's the fun of discussion.
Michael, and we'll make this the last question.
Michael Campbell from IAS. About 10 years ago I presented a paper at ASDAH and I argued that E.F. Albertsworth in the 19-teens was the first professionally trained Seventh-day Adventist historian from Johns Hopkins University, and actually there were a couple of them that together formed what I argue is the first generation of Adventist historians before even Olson.
Thank you, and we look forward in the next session actually to hearing about Emmy Olson, who is an interesting case. But let's thank all three of our speakers for getting us off to a very good start.